Writing. Eduardo Salazar had spent more than 30 years building one of the country's largest construction companies. His name appeared in magazines, business conferences, and television interviews. To the world, he was the perfect example of success. He owned luxury homes, expensive cars, and enough money to provide comfort for several generations. Yet every night, after the applause faded and the meetings ended, one question lingered in his mind. If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would still stand beside him? The question became impossible to ignore after he accidentally overheard a conversation at home. Returning early from a business trip, he walked quietly through the hallway and heard voices coming from the living room. His wife Patricia laughed as she told their children that Eduardo always knew how to make more money. Marcos, their eldest son, joked that he hoped his inheritance would arrive before he turned 50. Valeria, their daughter, smiled and said she could never imagine living without luxury. Not one of them asked whether Eduardo was tired, healthy, or happy. Every sentence revolved around money. Eduardo remained hidden behind the doorway, feeling a pain deeper than any financial loss he had ever experienced. That evening he barely touched his dinner. While everyone talked excitedly about vacations and expensive purchases, he quietly watched them, wondering if they even noticed the sadness in his eyes. The following morning he met privately with his longtime lawyer and his loyal driver, Miguel. Both men had worked beside him for more than 20 years. Eduardo explained his unusual plan. He wanted the world to believe he had lost everything. His company would secretly continue operating under trusted executives while the public believed it had collapsed after disastrous investments. Eduardo himself would disappear for several weeks and return home pretending to be an ordinary man with no fortune left. His lawyer hesitated. "This may break your heart." Eduardo nodded. "Living with uncertainty has already done that." Within days newspapers published shocking headlines. Television channels discussed Eduardo's supposed bankruptcy. Financial experts analyzed the fall of one of the country's richest businessmen. Social media exploded with rumors. Friends stopped calling. Business partners suddenly became unavailable. Eduardo rented a small apartment on the edge of the city. He exchanged his tailored suits for faded jeans, worn boots, and simple shirts. He left behind his expensive watch and carried only a small backpack. Looking at himself in the mirror, even he struggled to recognize the powerful businessman he had once been. When he finally returned to his mansion, the guard almost refused to let him enter. Only after Eduardo quietly spoke his name did the man realize who stood before him. Inside, Patricia stared at him in disbelief. "What happened to you?" Eduardo sighed deeply. "I lost everything." She looked around as if expecting hidden cameras. "The company, it's gone. Our savings, used to pay debts. Our vacation home, sold." She stood silently for several seconds before asking the one question that hurt him most. "So, what happens to us now?" Not once did she ask whether he was all right. Marcos entered moments later. His expression changed from confusion to anger. "You promised the business was secure." "I believed it was. You've ruined everything." Eduardo calmly answered, "We'll have to start over." Marcos laughed bitterly. "I didn't spend years preparing to live like an ordinary person." Without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out. Later that afternoon Valeria arrived carrying shopping bags from luxury boutiques. She looked at her father's clothes with disgust. "Please tell me this isn't real." "I'm afraid it is." She crossed her arms. "I can't live like this." She packed several suitcases and announced she would stay with friends until things improved. By sunset the enormous mansion felt empty. Only Rosa, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the family for 3 decades, approached Eduardo with tears in her eyes. "I'm just thankful you're safe." She embraced him tightly. For the first time that day, Eduardo felt comfort. The following morning Patricia announced she would temporarily move in with her sister. She explained that she needed stability and couldn't deal with financial uncertainty. She kissed neither his cheek nor his forehead before leaving. The silence after the front door closed felt heavier than any business failure. Eduardo decided to visit his older sister Elena. Unlike him, Elena had never cared about wealth. She lived in a modest house with a tiny vegetable garden and a front porch filled with colorful flowers. When she opened the door and saw her younger brother standing there in old clothes, she immediately hugged him. "My dear brother," Eduardo whispered, "I lost everything." She smiled gently. "No, you didn't." He looked at her, confused. "You still have your kindness, your wisdom, and your heart. Those are the things that matter." She invited him inside and prepared a simple lunch of soup, fresh bread, and tea. They spent hours remembering childhood adventures, laughing about old family stories, and talking about their parents. Eduardo realized he hadn't laughed like that in years. As the weeks passed, the truth about the people around him became painfully clear. Former business associates disappeared. Friends who had once insisted on expensive dinners suddenly stopped answering calls. His phone remained silent most days. Yet every weekend Elena arrived carrying homemade meals. Miguel often visited after work to help repair broken furniture in Eduardo's tiny apartment. Rosa secretly brought groceries whenever she noticed the refrigerator becoming empty. One rainy afternoon Eduardo slipped while carrying shopping bags. Fruit rolled across the sidewalk. Before he could gather everything, Rosa appeared with an umbrella. "You should have called me," she said with a smile. "I didn't want to trouble you." She laughed softly. "Years ago, when my husband died, you paid for my son's education without telling anyone. Today it's my turn to help." Eduardo felt tears forming in his eyes. Kindness never truly disappears. It often returns when we need it most. Several more weeks passed before Patricia officially requested a divorce. Her lawyer stated that she no longer wished to remain married to someone without financial security. Eduardo signed the documents quietly. His heart hurt, but his doubts were finally gone. Soon afterward he invited Patricia, Marcos, and Valeria to what he described as an important meeting regarding his remaining debts. Reluctantly they agreed. When they arrived, they were surprised to find themselves entering the headquarters of Eduardo's company. Employees greeted him respectfully. Executives welcomed him with smiles. The boardroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Marcos looked around in confusion. "I thought the company was bankrupt." Eduardo walked to the front of the room wearing an elegant suit. The company never failed. Silence filled the room. Patricia's face turned pale. It was all a lie. It was a test. No one spoke. "I needed to know whether my family loved me or only my fortune." Patricia rushed toward him. "I was confused. I didn't mean to leave." Eduardo gently shook his head. "You had every opportunity to stay." Marcos lowered his eyes. "I was angry. You were free to be angry. But you were never forced to abandon your father." Valeria began crying. "I'm sorry." Eduardo looked at her with compassion. "I hope one day you understand that wealth is a gift, not an identity." Then the conference room doors opened. Elena entered, followed by Miguel and Rosa. Eduardo smiled warmly. These are the people who never left. Everyone remained silent as his lawyer distributed new copies of Eduardo's estate plan. Most of Eduardo's fortune would now fund hospitals, schools, scholarships, and housing projects for struggling families. Elena, Rosa, and Miguel each received generous financial gifts in recognition of their loyalty and love. Patricia and the children would still receive enough to live comfortably, but only a small portion compared to what they had once expected. No one argued. Deep inside, they knew they had failed the test. Eduardo stepped closer to his children. "I still love both of you." They looked surprised. "But I cannot reward selfishness. I hope this experience teaches you something money never could." Marcos finally broke down. "I'm ashamed." Valeria nodded through her tears. "So am I." Eduardo embraced them. Forgiveness did not erase their mistakes, but it opened the possibility of becoming better people. Months later, life looked very different. Eduardo spent less time chasing bigger profits and more time visiting schools his foundation supported. He enjoyed quiet afternoons drinking tea with Elena in her little garden. Miguel became more like family than an employee. Rosa retired comfortably, knowing her future was secure. Little by little, Marcos began volunteering at one of the charitable organizations funded by his father. He discovered satisfaction in helping others instead of chasing luxury. Valeria also changed. She sold many of her expensive belongings and began working with children from low-income families. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely proud of herself. One afternoon a young journalist interviewed Eduardo during the opening of a new community center. "What is the greatest lesson success has taught you?" she asked. Eduardo smiled thoughtfully. "For many years I believed wealth was measured by bank accounts, expensive homes, and business achievements. I was wrong." The reporter waited quietly. "The richest people are those surrounded by love that expects nothing in return. Money can attract attention, admiration, and even fake affection. But only hardship reveals who truly belongs in your life." As the interview ended, Eduardo looked across the playground where dozens of children laughed together. Their happiness reminded him that real success was never about accumulating more. It was about giving more, loving more, and recognizing the priceless value of loyal hearts. He had pretended to lose everything, but in the end he discovered the greatest treasure of all. Genuine love cannot be bought, inherited, negotiated, or earned with riches. It remains when the money is gone, when the titles disappear, and when life becomes difficult. And once you find those who stay beside you through every storm, you realize you were never poor at all.